Okay. Hi. Hi. Good evening, everyone. Hi. Sorry for the slight delay, but we were waiting for a few more to come in, and thanks everyone for turning out tonight for a very special book talk. I'll get to introducing Ashley properly in a minute. He's come from Chiang Mai for this. I'm Gwen Robinson, Vice President of the Foreign Correspondents Club and Editor-at-Large of Nikkei Asia. And I just wanted to say a couple of things about our program next week and going forward to remind. So on Monday, October 16th, we have a movie club night looking at the diary of October 14th, 1973. It's a less known, less followed student massacre at Thammasat University, which I think gets less attention than the 1976 massacre. And we've got one of the leading film archivists and critics in Thailand, Kong Ritti, presenting a very rare film. I mean, it's difficult to see this film on that event with Panu Wongchom, our former president. So that's on Monday the 16th. We also have our very popular pub trivia night coming back again on October 27, and various other, and we even have a workshop on Taiwanese tea appreciation. So there's lots of things coming up, and there's a couple more Myanmar events. So please look at our website or our Facebook page. And meanwhile, I am going to kick off our event tonight. And as you all know, we're hosting Ashley South, author of the book you can see up on the screen there, Conflict, Complexity and Climate Change. So I'm going to just tell you a tiny bit about Ashley, who describes himself as an independent writer and consultant, specialising in humanitarian and political issues in Myanmar and Southeast Asia. Ashley has a doctorate from the ANU, Australia, and a master's from SOAS, University of London, and is a research fellow at Chiang Mai University. And as possibly most of you know, he's been writing about Burma and visiting conflict-affected parts of the country for more than 20 years, with key areas of research interest including ethnic conflict and self-determination struggles, federalism and the like in Burma, and also in Mindanao, the Philippines. He looks at forced migration, refugees and IDPs, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and mother tongue-based and multilingual education. So tonight, as you know, he's talking about this book on the screen, which brings together the two greatest challenges facing Burma: how to build federalism from the bottom up after the catastrophic military takeover, and addressing the devastating impacts of climate change, which are already affecting the country and, as it already looks, will get much, much worse. But as a bonus part of the evening, which I think you all read on the blurb, he's going to tell us a bit about his new mystery novel, Nancy and the Count, Vampire's Gold, which is a vampire climate change adventure, if you can get your head around that, set in London, Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Mae Sot on the Thai-Myanmar border, and in the Karen Free State of Kortu Lay. So that's, I think, a bit of a cherry on top of a lot of earnest discussion about federalism in Myanmar and climate change. So, Ashley, over to you.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Yep, I'm going to talk about my new book, as Gwen mentioned, published by Chiang Mai University and the ICRD in Canada. And also, as Gwen mentioned, I'm going to talk about the other novel I published a couple of months back, Nancy and the Count, Vampire's Gold. So first, I'd better begin with the day job. I'll provide a web page towards the end of the talk where you can download this book for free from the Chiang Mai University website. Along the way, I'm going to talk about some of the different themes and issues in the book, in my work over the past couple of years on climate change and conflict issues in Myanmar. And then we'll see how I segue into the vampire novel. I'm fairly confident it's the finest vampire climate change novel ever written. If not, it's certainly the best one set in Thailand, Burma, and London. So I'll come round to that towards the end. So it's traditional to begin with a methodology section. So here's me in Burma last year. This is actually a Free Burma Rangers training mission. We're about 1 kilometre here from one of several Myanmar army bases that dot the northern part of Karen state. And probably because people like me were so noisy, but we were there for 4 or 5 hours, and apparently in the army base, just out of view from this photo, there were about 30 or 40 Myanmar army soldiers, and I didn't see one of them. They were hunkered down in foxholes and bunkers for the whole time. And I think one of the Myanmar army soldiers the next day stuck his head out of the bunker, and one of the Karen soldiers took a shot at him, and he popped back down again. And it was very interesting for me because it really showed the degree to which the Myanmar army in Karen areas since the coup has been on the retreat, and in places they haven't already been kicked out of, they really are sort of hunkered down. So that was a very interesting day. Obviously can't spend too much time talking about my adventures in Burma, but I think I'll just continue one more episode. I think it was the next day, a couple of miles away at another Myanmar army base. There was sound of gunfire most days, sometimes fairly close, which was quite worrying for me, not being a military guy, but nevertheless, that's what it was. On one occasion, I think the day after this photo was taken, we met a KNLA, that's Karen National Liberation Army, captain who had just launched an ambush. And we'd heard the ambush an hour or two previously, mortar fire, machine gun fire. And basically he said that the Myanmar army troops had left on patrol from a base not far, as I say, from the one out of view in this picture. The Tatmadaw soldiers, one of them had stepped on a landmine, and probably the Myanmar army soldier who did that was killed by the landmine, and that's when the Karen army launched their ambush. And the interesting part, particularly for me, was the KNLA captain said, well, we know we killed at least one of them, we think we might have killed 4. The whole engagement was over in 15 minutes, and then the KNLA disappeared back into the jungle with a couple of rifles they'd picked up off the enemy. And so that was just one encounter with at least 1, maybe 5 casualties. So I'm guessing that the KNLA probably marked it up as 5 casualties. But just during the couple of weeks that we were right on the front line, there were dozens of such incidents in just the one village tract where I was traveling at the time. And when I got back to Thailand, this was during a period when the KNU had actually issued a notice to say that hundreds and hundreds of Myanmar army soldiers had been killed during the previous year, and I actually had emails from a couple of embassies and journalists saying, actually, that can't really be true. Can it? And I don't really know. I don't think anyone really is entirely on top of the numbers. But the level at which the KNLA was effectively taking out the Myanmar army during the couple of trips where I was able to accompany them last year, if we extrapolate from the places I visited, I think that the numbers which are being posted about Myanmar army casualties and the military success of the quite diverse anti-junta movement seem to be quite credible. So I'll get onto a bit now more the topic of the book, but I thought it's a kind of start with a methodology section, as they say. So the book, this book, is about 2 main topics. One is the struggle for self-determination in Burma that goes back decades, and of course I won't have time today to get into any historical details. Many of you will be familiar with the politics of Burma, I think. And then trying, as Gwen said, to bring that together with the topic of climate change, which is, I think, the greatest challenge facing our planet, and including Myanmar. So I frame a lot of my work, the academic work, in terms of federalism, And I get sometimes into trouble for that because a lot of the work on federalism in Burma and globally is kind of legal constitutional in approach. I take a much more political approach, as you'll see. The background to discussions of federalism in Burma, I think most people will know that calls for federalism, genuine federalism, very widespread. Until recently, I think that the demands for federalism expressed by ethnic nationality communities, and particularly elites, ethnic leaders, have been not well articulated. It's more of an expression of a demand for freedom, self-determination, and a reaction against the violent assimilation and Burmanization of the Myanmar state. So we've got some technical definitions there of what is the meaning of federalism. In Myanmar, one of the big sets of questions is regarding which powers should remain with the federal union government in Naypyidaw or wherever, and which should be devolved to state government. I think that kind of approach, which normally is associated with attempts to devise the right kind of federal constitution, I think it hasn't been very successful in Myanmar. Partly because the complexity of the situation in Myanmar, the context on the ground is really quite staggering and diverse, and so any kind of federal solution will be inherently quite asymmetrical, which already makes things messy. But I want to take a different look at self-determination and see federalism, particularly the higher level, union level functions that are important to any country, rather than seeing them as something that can be defined constitutionally in advance. I would see these as higher level functions which emerge out of the resilience of some of the different anti-junta stakeholders in the country right now. Briefly hanging around to talk about federalism a bit longer. From what I've just said, you can probably see that I'm kind of setting up two different ideal type approaches to federalism. The traditional approach would be maybe what we could call federalizing. Sometimes it's known as the holding together approach, and that is the idea of decentralizing an existing unitary state. Whereas the federating approach, the coming together approach from the bottom up, is really much more like what happened in North America, or the birth of the United States in the late 18th century, and then the German and Italian unifications in the 19th century, where separate, effectively sovereign state bodies came together to form a new union. So I'm going to come back in a moment to say just a little bit more about the federating and the federalizing processes. The emergent bottom-up approach would be the federating process. So the book is quite short. It's one of its great advantages, and there's not too much historical detail there, but of course others have written about this, myself as well. Looking back at the 1947 Constitution of Burma, agreed just before independence, itself based on the 1947 Panglong Conference. I think we can see these as federating moments in the late colonial history of Burma, just on the eve of independence, when elites from the Bama-led independence movement, Bojo Aung San and his comrades and colleagues, and some ethnic leaders came together to agree what kind of country Burma could be. In a sense, they were seeking to federalize an existing unitary colony, but also it was a coming together moment, and I think we could see that as the previous federating moment in Myanmar's history. There's a lot written and said about Panglong, and whether this is actually how Bojo Aung San and the others at the conference really understood the events of those days is, I think, debatable. But certainly the Panglong Conference is seen retrospectively as a great federating moment and a state-making moment, a nation-making moment, even in Myanmar's history. So, again, not taking too much time on the historical background, but there have been a series of failed attempts to achieve federalism in Burma. And I think it should be noted in passing that at least under the previous, what we called the peace process from around 2012 till the coup of 2020, there was a period when discussions of federalism were more central in the Myanmar political scene. The Myanmar army even was on occasion heard, Min Aung Hlaing has spoken about the need for federalism in Burma before, as has Aung San Suu Kyi. So federalism did kind of come in from the cold a bit over the past decade, but really it is a classic contested concept. Federalism means very different things to different stakeholders. And I think we can see that with the manner in which the previous National League for Democracy-led government in Myanmar, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, really failed to lead the country in a direction which addressed the basic demands and aspirations for federalism and self-determination of ethnic communities. So already on the eve of the February 2021 coup, the demands for federalism from predominantly ethnic nationality stakeholders and elites, and the narrative of federalism from the central government were moving in pretty different directions. We had a failing peace process, and the politics of Myanmar were in a pretty dire state. So, classic quote from Milton Friedman. My politics are probably a bit to the left of Friedman, but it is a great quote. And I think it's a reality, too, that in times of crisis, what sometimes gets referred to in the Myanmar context these days as a critical juncture, when old narratives, identities, power holders are challenged and displaced, new ideas, new actors come to the fore, new ideas come to the fore. And federalism, I think, or more broadly, let's say self-determination, and I want to argue, and I want to advocate that climate action should be among the new ideas that we really need to take very seriously. And I think different actors and stakeholders are taking seriously in the new Myanmar that's emerging. So, yeah, I guess I've phrased that as a question here on the slide. And I've answered my question really by saying that following the February 2021 coup in Myanmar, the SAC junta is illegal and illegitimate. So in that case, where does legitimate political authority reside? And I'm saying that the predominantly ethnic nationality, and you might want to challenge me later, what do I mean by that? Because obviously there are many different ideas and approaches to what ethnic identity might mean. Anyway, let's keep it simple for now. Ethnic armed organizations, a whole range of civil society actors, not all of whom are working explicitly in ethnic nationalist ways. Nevertheless, these stakeholders, particularly at the subnational level, are the inheritors of political legitimacy. So my main argument is that in the absence of a credible, legitimate, or even legal central state in Myanmar, the balkanization, the fragmentation of Myanmar is well underway, and authority, resilience, and where we should be looking for inspiring leadership towards developing a new Burma can be found among these ethnic and other nations which made up the country prior to the British colonial adventure, and with the collapse of a state that was never really considered to be legitimate by many citizens of the purported state of Myanmar, I think we have a new opportunity to explore what those subnational polities might look like and what self-determination might look like from the bottom up. Okay, so yeah, just to recap. I think before the coup, those of us who've been working on Myanmar for a long time, some of us anyway, perhaps would have seen the challenge how to federalize a highly centralized authoritarian and military state in order to give more autonomy to the different sub-state units, which are normally considered to be the 14 states and regions which officially make up Myanmar. I think that challenge has profoundly changed since the coup. And I think it's become more and more clear in the last couple of years that the challenge now is how to rebuild a new Myanmar, a new Burma, from the bottom up. So it's really a challenge of de facto, and I would argue also really politically legitimate entities to come together and imagine and form a new Burma. There are multiple different stakeholders and ethno-linguistic networks and communities which need to be taken into account when thinking about Burma. We don't really have time for that tonight. I'm going to focus particularly on ethnic armed organizations. I'm going to use that language rather than ERO, which is, has become quite common in Myanmar discourse, but we can talk about that later if you like. There are hundreds of armed groups in Myanmar. I'm talking about a couple of dozen ethnic armed organizations which have well-established military and political functions, often controlling quite extensive areas of Myanmar, providing services, health, education, etc. to communities. Generally, either in areas which are exclusively controlled by the ethnic armed organization, in which case the EAO effectively is like a local government, or in areas where authority and often service delivery is contested with the Myanmar central authorities, whether that is ongoing armed conflict as across much of the country, or in some places, of course, there are still ceasefires in Myanmar. The contest is there, but it's a political contest. So I'm arguing that these EAOs and associated CSOs have significant capacity, political legitimacy, and are the building blocks of this new emergent federalism. There's another set of actors that I should briefly mention, and these are the state-based bodies. Ethnic armed organizations, as per the name, tend to be defined in terms of a particular ethno-linguistic nationality group, the Karen National Union, the Kachin Independence Organization. I think some of these EAOs demonstrate considerable inclusivity. So it's not to say that EAOs only stand for one ethnic community, but nevertheless, that is the tendency. These newly emergent state-based bodies, of which I think there are nearly a dozen now, are different in as much as they are based mostly on specific geographic areas. Probably the most well-known is the KSCC-IEC, the Karenni Interim Executive Council, which is, I think, the most well-known, the most dynamic, and the most successful example of a newly emergent state-based polity, militarily opposed to the SAC junta, fighting for self-determination for Karenni, not in the name of a particular ethnic group, Kaya, Kayan, Ganyo, there are so many ethnic groups in Myanmar and in Karenni state, but rather for an inclusive Karenni identity which is multi-ethnic. And so that's a really important difference between EAOs and state-based bodies as just a matter of principle. We could think about the relationship between these new state-based bodies and the national unity government. I think I'll save that for the end if people are interested, perhaps if there are questions at the end. I think we can also see very important and surprisingly, I would say resilient, new structures in places like Sagaing and Magwe, which are Bama majority areas, have not been insurgent against the central government authorities for many decades, but now are part of the struggle against the SAC junta. So people's administrative bodies and other structures are emerging in these places in Bama populated areas. And so we can see, therefore, that the anti-junta resistance in terms of its articulation as political and governance bodies is not limited only to ethnic nationality communities, but also to members of the Bama majority, for example, in Sagaing and Magwe. So I think the maps illustrate the point I made earlier, I hope they do, regarding the collapse of Myanmar army control since the coup. I was part of a small team that produced these maps. One of the hats I wear is I'm an advisor to the Free Burma Rangers. I'll talk a little bit more about the FBR later if we have time. So the shading in red is areas effectively controlled by the Myanmar army, more or less exclusively controlled by the Myanmar army. It doesn't mean the white areas are controlled by anti-junta or anti-Myanmar army forces. It could also be that they are contested. But I think the basic message of the maps is pretty simple. We can see in the coup that the Myanmar army has lost effective control of large parts of the country. And you can see in the map on the right, which is the post-coup map, there's a lot of little red dots across many of the ethnic states. And that, I think, certainly illustrates the phenomena that in many ethnic nationality populated areas, the Myanmar army is only present in downtown urban areas, barricaded with barbed wire into garrisons from which they launch attacks into surrounding country areas. So it's really quite a new development. As Gwen pointed out, I've been working on Myanmar for a long time, nearly 30 years, and I haven't seen anything like this in the last couple of years. So, of course, it's a very rough and ready map, set of maps, 2 maps, and there are individual details which could no doubt be challenged, but I think the overall trend is quite apparent. I hope so. And it's a striking phenomena, therefore, whereby anti-coup forces have taken control of or are actively contesting the Myanmar army across large parts of the country. Up until a couple of years ago, the Karen National Union, armed wing Karen National Liberation Army, had taken very few bases off the Myanmar army. I believe the last time the KNU successfully took and managed to hold on to Myanmar army bases was 1950, 1951. They haven't been able to take a single Myanmar army base in all the years since, until the coup, and the most recent count is they've taken about 50 in the last 2 years. So some of those are pretty small, but that includes at least 24 major Myanmar army bases that are now controlled by the KNU. So real big turnaround in fortunes of the insurgents. I'm going to move on now and talk about the relationship between these newly relevant struggles for self-determination and continue referencing the fact that ethnic armed organizations and other ethnic nationality political stakeholders have more relevance now and probably are more powerful now, are on the front foot now more so than at any time in the past 20, 50 years. And that's very striking, and that's the main message I want to talk about tonight. But the cost has been appalling. There have been, I don't have the data here because that's not the main purpose of my talk tonight, but I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the fact that the Myanmar army has been launching deadly airstrikes against its perceived opponents with increasing frequency for the past 2.5 years. I think the data shows that there were more airstrikes in the first quarter of this year than all of last year combined. So this increase in airstrikes on the part of the Myanmar army, I think illustrates the desperation and the degree of difficulty that they are finding on the ground. And it's really the ace card that they have militarily. It is an effective strategy to a certain extent, the use of military force against insurgents. It doesn't deny territory to the armed groups. I've spoken to a lot of different ethnic armed organizations about this over the past couple of years, but it does have a terrible psychological impact on communities. It causes people to flee, and that has knock-on impacts in terms of the ability of villagers to cultivate their crops and to harvest their crops. So the airstrikes not only have an immediately terrible, terrifying and deadly impact, but also have longer-term structural impacts as well. This series of photos were all taken by the Free Burma Rangers teams across Myanmar from a variety of different places around the country. That's a bomb that didn't go off in Karenni, and just the size of the thing, you can imagine the damage that occurs when these devices do, as they usually do, explode. This is a village in Karenni that was shelled by the Myanmar army about a month ago. And these are the civilians who were killed in that attack, and this is a funeral service for those civilians. When I was putting together this presentation, I kind of thought, well, I shouldn't really be showing these photos because my talk's about politics, federalism, and climate change. But I think partly this is a reminder for all of us that the kind of quite positive narrative which I'm developing, and really to sort of try and point out the importance of the political developments in the last couple of years, which I see as quite inspiring, and I think point towards a new Burma. But these achievements have been achieved at great cost with massive human suffering, and I think we we can't forget that. And I think it would be kind of disrespectful to gloss over it. So the next photo coming up is quite gruesome, so I'll only keep it on the screen for a moment. This is, you may have seen that there was a drone attack on a Kachin IDP camp 2 nights ago. I've got the wrong date on the slide, sorry, you'll see in a minute. It was 2 nights ago, it was the 9th of October, sorry, that's correct, yeah. It was a drone attack on an IDP camp. I've been to these IDP camps. They look like IDP camps. They don't look like military sites. I think, although I'm not a military guy, it seems to me that it would be impossible not to realize from the vantage of a drone hovering not so far above that these were civilian settlements that were attacked. So yeah, there's a couple of, like, not gory, but pretty terrible photos coming up, so trigger warning. This is a couple of nights ago, just outside of Liza. This is a different Kachin IDP camp, also not far from Liza. I put the photo there because you can see it looks like an IDP camp. And some of them have more prominent UN and WFP, UNHCR logos on some of the sheeting that's used for roofing. There's really no mistaking it for a military settlement. And yet the resilience of ethnic people, of EAOs, is extraordinary. This is another grab from a whole bunch of photos which my brother and sister rangers sent me for tonight. And I like this one in particular because it's a teacher, right? He's trying to prepare a lesson. He doesn't even have a chalkboard. He's doing it on the side of a piece of wood, as you can see. And yeah, a bit of a shout out for this is a Free Burma Ranger medic. But you could swap out the shoulder patch for, I think, most of the main ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar. FBR, of course, is not an ethnic armed organization. FBR is a Christian-inspired humanitarian agency. But most of the ethnic armed organizations across Myanmar field their own medical teams, and there are CSOs working in the war zones providing life-saving treatment to civilians. And that's part of the capacity, the incredible resilience which I'm talking about tonight. So the other part of the story, the other part of the book, is about the climate crisis in Burma and climate action. This is a photo from the hills of Khian State, taken I guess about a year before the coup, I think. Okay, so I hope we don't need to spend too much time discussing the reality of climate change. I think it's the global crisis of our times, probably the most fundamental challenge which humans have faced, I think, in the last 10,000 years. And sometimes we think about climate change, it often gets presented to me that climate change affects everyone. And so it's kind of can be an area where we can look for common ground between different stakeholders. And even maybe climate action can be a way towards peace building. I don't object to any of that per se, but I think that like most things in life, the impacts of climate change are quite differential, and generally it's poor and marginalized groups that suffer the most. So whilst climate change may be common for all peoples and all countries, I think the impacts are not necessarily commonly felt and shared. A second sort of hypothesis, I suppose, which I'm sort of developing in the book and tonight, is regarding the disruptions of climate change. My opinion is that Myanmar will not recover from the current crisis. I think it's going to drag on for a long time. And furthermore, I think that we ain't seen nothing yet. I think I'll come on to it a little later, but as we see the impacts of climate change beginning to kick in, the potential collapse of food security across the country, I think that we may fairly soon get to a point in Myanmar where the already fragmented state will completely collapse. I think it's very difficult to see how even a well-functioning state of Myanmar can maintain in anything like the current pre-coup situation once climate change rigors really start kicking in. So I think Myanmar is something of an outlier for other parts of the country, a highly conflict-affected state with strong society, great deal of resilience, but the functions and the structures of government having already been stressed and shown to be quite illegitimate and violent by the coup, I think will be further undermined, and I think the state of Myanmar will be further disrupted by climate change to the point where I don't think it's even going to be a very useful conversation to ask whether we can rebuild Myanmar. I think it's obvious that we can't, although, of course, that's a narrative which is resisted by particularly many regional powers and diplomats, as the state-based international system is so committed to maintaining nation states at all costs. But I think in Myanmar's case, it's probably too late. Yeah, I think that's about it. For a different audience, I'd probably spend a bit longer pointing out the science behind climate change, the impacts. I think these are a couple of quotes from the most recent IPCC report. I'm sure everyone knows about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the aggregation of thousands of scientific studies to produce this data. And basically, things are bad, they're going to get much worse, and vulnerable, conflict-affected countries will really be bearing the brunt of it. These already worrying elements are being exacerbated by the impacts of the Niño weather events, and I think we can see that now. You'll probably know that September was not only the hottest month in the last 10,000 years, but also was 0.5 degrees centigrade higher than any previous September, which is a big amount. That's globally. Across Southeast Asia, floods, heat waves, and rainfall are the main climate change hazards that are faced by many different countries. Myanmar is particularly vulnerable because 70% of the population works in the agricultural sector, one way or the other. The final point, I think, is the one I made earlier, that extreme weather impacts are not necessarily disastrous. It depends on the resilience of communities. It depends on the resources which communities bring and can mobilize in order to respond to disasters. So a little more climate data. We've seen annual temperatures rising on average 0.4 degrees centigrade per decade in Myanmar, and that's likely to increase. In fact, certainly is increasing as far as we can tell. The rainfall is really striking. In Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, but certainly, we're getting more or less the same amount of rain as previous years, a little bit more perhaps, but not much more. It's falling in a much smaller period. So the rainy season is actually about 50 days shorter now than it was in the 1970s and 80s. So we get late onset of rains, making it very unpredictable for farmers, really playing havoc with crops that have evolved or been selected to deal with the pre-climate change predictability of weather. But also because you get more intense rain falling in a shorter period, that produces flooding and agricultural runoff, the collapse of soil fertility, and widespread landslides. And we see this happening already across different parts of Myanmar. There's very limited data coming out of Myanmar since the coup. Not surprisingly, most people are focusing on the horror of Myanmar army abuses, attacks, documenting the appalling human rights situation. It's very, very difficult to work in Myanmar now, particularly on sort of longer term things like climate change. From conversations I've had, I guess you could say focus group discussions and key informant interviews with people in Rakhine State, Magwe region, Mandalay region, Kachin State, Karen State, Karenni State, Mon State, and Taninthai region, the farmers report pretty similar patterns, what I just described. The crops are, the yield this year is expected to be the rice yield, and we should have better idea in a month or two because we're just coming up to harvest time. It looks like the rice yield is really bad this year. It's very, very bad in some upland areas, and primarily because of a combination of high temperatures and flooding. And I think we will see very serious food insecurity in localized areas of Myanmar this year, and unless the patterns of climate change are reversed, which I think is almost impossible in the short term, we will see further and more serious impacts on agriculture in the years to come. So, yeah, flooding, landslides. This is something that perhaps there are people here who know more about it than me. I'm not a climate scientist. It seems to me that in some areas, pristine forest lends itself to landslides. So I think often rainforests and deciduous forests, as we find across much of Myanmar, have quite thin topsoil, and underneath there's a lot of rock, and that's where the mountains come from. If you get very, very intense rains at the beginning of the rainy season, it lifts the topsoil, and you get whole mountains just collapsing down the side of the mountain. So this was from northern Karen state, and we're getting reports of really unprecedented amounts of landslide activity across different parts of Myanmar, Karen, Kachin, Chin, as a result of the intense rains that have been falling. So I'll talk a bit more about climate action, mitigation, and the important roles forests have to play. So I guess I can get onto that pretty quickly. That's against the backdrop of widespread deforestation in Myanmar. Myanmar still has some of the best forest cover in the world in terms of percentage of the country's land area, but deforestation has accelerated considerably in the last couple of decades and is a great concern. And I think I'll mention it again later, but we also need to be aware that in many of the areas where deforestation is occurring, it's not just because the SAC junta is selling logging and mining concessions, which they are, but also some of the ethnic armed and other opposition groups I'm talking about are involved in the logging and mining business too. So, you know, the morality is not always black and white. So, generally, looking at the literature, policy developments in other parts of the world, non-state armed groups are generally not much considered in relation to climate action. I want to push back against that in the Myanmar context. I think we should not be using the terminology non-state armed groups when it comes to Myanmar, because the ethnic armed organizations I'm talking about at least purport to represent ethnic nations. So the Karen National Union is fighting for the Karen homeland of Kothule. The Kachin Independence Army is fighting for the Kachin homeland, Kachin land. And so these are not non-state armed groups, but they are, of course, not recognized internationally, not part of the United Nations system, etc. Some of these groups control really quite extensive forested areas. Indeed, the best forests in Myanmar and some of the best remaining forests in mainland Southeast Asia are located in Karen, Kachin, and other parts of Burma under the authority of ethnic armed organizations. And although many of these groups have in the past derived significant income from logging and mining activities, and some still do, nevertheless, the better established groups have established forest management policies and practices, often in partnership with communities. When I first started working on the Thailand border in the 1990s, the KNU Forestry Department was basically a logging operation. And the income was used to fight the war, and maybe some of it went into people's back pockets. These days, the Kothule Forestry Department has a logging ban across all 7 of the KNU districts, not always respected very much to the letter on the ground, but generally there is a logging ban in place in KNU areas. And the KNU Forest Department has transformed itself from being basically a logging operation to being a community-based forest governance and management organization. So it shows that change is possible even in the midst of civil war, and that an organization like the Karen National Union has been able to turn its forestry policies around from one of rampant natural resource extraction to quite serious stewardship of the natural heritage. So I've talked about resilience. I've mentioned that ethnic armed organizations in the past have been involved in quite a wide range of unsustainable or otherwise questionable practices in terms of income generation, logging, mining, the drugs business, the black market trade, etc. I think one of the questions this raises then, which is probably for another day, unless perhaps people are interested later we can talk, what is the funding model for self-determination in Myanmar? If we are arguing that ethnic armed organizations should be, I'm arguing they should be encouraged and supported in moving away from a reliance on logging and mining revenues for fighting their existential struggle for self-determination and survival, then what's going to replace that income? I think the international community has a responsibility here. We have global funds established to support the maintenance of forests and to try and combat deforestation. These ethnic armed organizations and the CSOs in the areas where they are operating are committed to those very ends. So I think there needs to be more done to find ways of financing these, the services and the governance in these areas, which will allow ethnic armed organizations to move away from dependence on logging and mining. And I think global climate change funding could be used for that purpose. So, there are two ways, really, of looking at climate change action. We can break it down into adaptation and mitigation. So you're probably familiar with the concept of adaptation, responding to the pressures, the hazards of climate change, and the variety of different actions which communities, civil society organizations, local authorities, in this case mostly talking about ethnic armed organizations, can take in order to address climate change issues, try and respond, try to adapt livelihoods and agriculture to the threats of climate change. And there's quite a long list here. The book has 4 or 5 pages of recommendations at the end, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. I do think that the new technologies of solar and hydropower, micro hydro that is, not large scale hydro, that have become technologically feasible in the last 5 years or so, can be real game changers in terms of the political economies of Myanmar. Because these kind of technologies mean it is now possible to generate fairly substantial electrical power in a very decentralized local manner. So you no longer need to be part of a national or an international grid in order to generate the kind of electricity energy that's needed to support small industries, to light schools, to provide electricity to hospitals, etc. So this can be done in quite a decentralized manner, I think. Also, on the theme of federalism and adaptation, I think there is a key concept in federalism, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is basically the idea that decisions should be taken and funding should be made available as close as possible to the ground. And I think in disaster risk reduction globally, this is seen to be best practice. So clearly there is a good line-up there between the principle of subsidiarity and federalism, best practice in disaster risk reduction, and the aspiration and demands of ethnic nationality communities and elites in Myanmar for self-determination. And they line up pretty well together when it comes to climate action, I think. Yeah. So the second set of actions that we can think about when looking at climate change is mitigation. And mitigation can include space rockets up into the upper atmosphere to sprinkle little crystals to reflect sunlight back into the solar system. That's not something I know much about and sounds terribly dangerous to me. So the science and certainly the best development practice would be nature-based solutions rather than rockets up into the sky. So Myanmar, like other developing countries, bears little responsibility for the climate crisis affecting our planet. Historically, Burma, and particularly the ethnic upland areas I'm mostly talking about tonight, have done almost nothing to release the carbon dioxide and other gases which are driving climate change. Nevertheless, they are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Also, as mentioned, we know that forests are essential to mitigating and slowing climate change through carbon drawdown, which I'll get onto in a minute. The best remaining forests in mainland Southeast Asia are in ethnic nationality conflict-affected parts of Myanmar and have a globally important role to play in mitigating climate change. There's a great quote here from Professor Artaxo Neto, who's a member of the IPCC, sorry. No cheaper, easier or faster way to reduce CO2 emissions than reducing tropical deforestation. It's carbon drawdown. I think the basic process is pretty straightforward, really. Plants, trees are big plants, of course, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis in exchange for oxygen, and the carbon is sequestered through roots, through mycelial networks deep into the ground. So this is carbon drawdown. This is why we talk about forests as being important for mitigating climate change. And the next part I've said already, I think that some of the best remaining forests in mainland Southeast Asia are in ethnic nationality populated areas. These are resources for the ethnic communities, for Kachinland, for Kothule. These are the natural heritage, the base from which Karen culture and society emerges. They're also important for Myanmar as economic assets, potentially, if well managed, and in order to help to support more livable local environments, because there's increasing data available to show that forests can attract rainfall locally, and as well as the carbon drawdown, forests can help to produce more livable, more balanced local environments. Also, of course, the incredible biodiversity that exists in forests, the massive future benefits in terms of medicines, in terms of the wealth for the forest dwellers that might be derived from those medicines. Someone said to me a while ago that the forests of Myanmar could be as important as the oil fields of Saudi Arabia at the beginning of the 20th century. That we're only just beginning to see the incredible value that can come out of these forests if we can maintain and protect them, as local communities, EAOs and CSOs are attempting to do. So I guess it all kind of then comes back round to localization. Repeated calls and commitments internationally by aid donors to localize aid. And yet, again and again, failures to do so. A very small proportion of international donor aid goes directly through local actors. I think it's less than 2%. It's very, very low in Myanmar as well. Most donors prefer to give to big international NGOs, UN agencies, etc., who then dole out support to smaller NGOs. Eventually, some of the money gets to CSOs. This is not really localization. But as the local communities and stakeholders, the ethnic armed organizations, are the ones fighting for their survival. It's an existential struggle in Myanmar, and they are fighting in their homelands, which have such important value for the communities of Burma, but for the globe. I think there's a really strong moral argument to say that if these local stakeholders don't chop down the trees, do protect the forest, then the international community, I think, has an obligation to try and support them to do that. And of course, it's a win-win, because that also helps to support the struggle against the SAC junta. So I think the basic message there actually the message of both books really is, I'm not sure Myanmar's going to recover from the current crisis, but I think Burma, as a multi-ethnic, inclusive nation, is being reimagined, is incredibly resilient, and some of the struggle for self-determination and to protect the environment against the junta is truly inspiring. And so that's really why I wanted to write the book. And it is available. You can get it off my website if you want, www.ashleysouth.uk, or a bit big now to write all that down, but you can find that address on my website too. And the second link here is the link to the Chiang Mai University RCSD website, where you can download a soft copy of the book. There is a Myanmar language version being prepared, so we should have a Burmese translation available fairly soon. And there's another website up there, Frogmort Press. Frogmort Press, which has a new Substack channel as well, just started last week for those who are Substackers. Frogmort Press is the publisher. Frank Merrifellow is the author of the greatest vampire climate change adventure ever written, undoubtedly the best vampire climate change story ever set in Mae Sot, Chiang Mai and Kothule, Nancy and the Count. What more can I say? There are flyers available at the end of the room. You can ask me for one if you like. If you scan the QR code, it will take you to the Frogmort Press website. where you can order a hard copy of the book from Barnes and Noble or Amazon if you like, or you can get an e-book as well, which is only $7.99. We're also preparing a Mesot edition, which will be a paperback edition printed locally in Thailand. And this is the present edition, which you can buy or download, with a wonderful, I hope you will agree, graphic by my dear friend Ko Zo-u. And then another dear friend, our friend Luce, was inspired by the book to produce this beautiful artwork. And I shouldn't really say too much about the novel, and I think it's for other people to judge if it's any good. But I feel so grateful that the novel has inspired people to come up with this amazing original art, and I just think that's just so beautiful. And I say so because obviously it's not by me, it's by someone else. And strangely, that's Nancy, in case you didn't realize. That is what she looks like. It's quite strange to have someone draw a representation of a book that one has published and capture it so well. I'll wait and see if anyone's interested in discussing Nancy and the Count, because we're almost up to the hour.
Well, Ashley, I think you could tell people a little bit about what the book is.
Well, Andreas, our beta reader, can tell people a little bit about what the book is. This is a sort of a synopsis, I suppose, of the plot. It's pretty much what I said. It's a vampire climate change adventure. The first half of the novella, it's quite short again, so both of these books have the great advantage of being not too long. The first half is set in London. The second half is set in Chiang Mai, Mesot, and the Karen Free State of Korthule. The novel seems to be set in an adjacent reality. Merrifellow seems to think that writing about Burma through the lens of fiction allows the author to touch on Burma, to think about and talk about and write about and feel about Burma in a way that just is much more difficult to do in the restrictions of a sort of academic policy type book. The need for footnotes. Everything in here is supposed to be true. Writing a novel, one has far more freedom and quite a liberating experience, according to Merrifellow. So I would encourage you to scan the QR code. There's a couple of bookshops in Chiang Mai where you can buy the hard copy. We are preparing a Mesot edition, as I said. I was very keen, I'm very pleased with Andreas's comments, so you got them twice tonight. This is the first publication from Frogmort Press. As I said, you can order the books from those various sources. And I think probably having hopefully intrigued you a little about the prospect of Nancy and the Count, I would love it if some people would buy the book, of course, because then I make some money. But most of all, I want people to read the story, and I hope that some of you will. So again, thanks for coming along tonight, and thank you, Gwen. And if there are any questions or comments, happy to try and field those.
Okay. Can I also safely say that I think this is the first event we've ever had which kind of spans, you know, sort of human rights crisis, climate change inside Burma, ethnic rebellion, etc., and vampire.
And vampires, right.
Yeah, so that's really quite a first on all fronts, Ashley.
Inclusiveness,
So
that's what we're after.
if anyone, after that brazen part of self-promotion, which actually, no, I'm a big fan of Ashley's, and I think this book is quite unique, and would recommend.
Carefully chosen words. Great.
And we are going to have a little Q&A session, but first, I think I'll just take you up on something, Ashley, there, which is you really drew a lot of all those issues were brilliant and spot on. A lot of what you said, but I think also, and it is interesting to highlight the shift amongst EAOs from actually being part of the problem in terms of environmental destruction, but on a very small scale, you know, their logging and other activities. Let's not forget lots of bits of mining and things like that. But actually, the more serious problem seems to be from the junta itself, this complete all bets are off in terms of any effort to, I think they've let go of all the efforts on environmental impact assessments on any projects. The mining, the illegal logging is out of control. We're seeing all kinds of expansions, I think, of various projects, including their desperate bid for energy. So we're not quite, I mean, the information is not particularly clear, but I think that seems to be an element missing from what you're saying, is that kind of top-down. But how is that feeding into, what we've got is the reality of climate change. So if you're focusing on climate change and the coup, what are your thoughts on?
Yes,
on
no,
that?
I didn't get into it too much tonight. There's a bit in the book, and there are a number of really excellent CSOs out there that are documenting, and media outlets, of course, journalists as well, who are covering the SAC junta's environmental crimes. And yeah, it really looks like a scramble for cash. I mean, one of the many stupid, self-defeating aspects of the coup is the way that it has so undermined an economy which was maybe just beginning to recover from decades of military mismanagement. And so the Myanmar economy is collapsing, and that has multiple impacts. It means that there are large numbers of people who now don't have work, don't have food, don't have income, and in rural areas that often means that people turn to the forest. And that's not necessarily unsustainable if it's done in a smart manner with low population densities. But one of the consequences of the widespread forced displacement of civilians, and there's more than 1 million internally, I think there's more than 2 million internally.
It's 2 million.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 2 million IDPs in Myanmar. Many of those people are displaced in forested areas, and that does have an impact on the environment. It also, in places like Karenni,
Do you want to?
Karenni, well, I think you can probably see where it is in the halfway up on the right, the smallest state in Myanmar.
Maybe you can point to it, actually.
So it's the smallest state in Myanmar. It's the location of the Karenni Interim Executive Council, which I mentioned earlier, and probably one of the parts of certainly one of the parts of Myanmar which has been most noteworthy in its resistance of the SAC junta. It's really extraordinary. Large parts of Karenni state are controlled by opposition forces providing health, education, etc. to civilians and fighting against the junta, defending civilians against junta attacks. But also it's the most, it has the worst water supply in Myanmar, basically, Karenni, as far as I understand. Really serious groundwater problems. And forced migration is causing changes in population density in quite remote areas where they don't have much water, and the stress on what little water is available, access to that water, I think potentially can drive conflicts within displaced communities. That's not necessarily what you were talking about, Gwen, and this is happening in a context where the SAC is cash-strapped and has been issuing logging and mining concessions across the country in order basically to get the money coming in to buy the guns to kill the people. Of course, that's rather simplistic, but not too far off the mark, I think. So the junta is ravaging the country, pillaging the country, or at least its cronies are. And in that context, of course, EAOs also have a need for income. And as I was mentioning, I think this is one of the great challenges facing ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar. They say, I think with a high degree of credibility, that they are seeking to represent their own communities, to protect ethnic nationality civilians from attack by the junta, which is, I think, certainly true, and also to lead a resurgent movement for self-determination on the part of these ethnic communities. That needs money, and often ethnic armed organizations have felt they have little choice but to undertake logging or mining activities. I think this is really coming now to a point, particularly in the north, in Kachin. So that's the yellow state at the top, and the Kachin communities also live in adjacent areas of Sagaing region and Shan state, northern Shan state. The Kachin Independence Organization has also gone through a process over the last several years of taking forest conservation much more seriously. The KIO has a pretty thorough, well thought through environmental conservation and forestry strategy that is being developed in partnership with CSOs and communities. But at the same time, as many people will know if you've been following the news, there have been protests by Kachin communities about the extraction of rare earths and other natural resources in Kachin areas. Not only by the KIO, in fact, most of the extraction is by the junta and by allied groups that are working more or less as proxies of the junta, border guard forces. But nevertheless, all armed groups in Kachin, to one degree or another, have been involved in these kind of activities. And I think one of the real challenges is how to find alternative sources of income and to put a high enough political priority on conserving the ethnic nationality communities' environmental and natural heritage, and prioritizing the protection of that heritage, even though these groups are in often quite desperate need of income. And I think ultimately that's a political decision. And I see those changes happening in my conversations around the country. And I find that is for me, one of the reasons why I still have great hope for what Myanmar can achieve in terms of climate action. Because I think that there is a growing realization among EAOs and other leaders of the importance of these issues.
Right, thanks. I'd like to turn to the floor. If any of you have any question you'd like to ask Ashley, please, the microphone is up there. Just identify yourself. But while people might think about things, I actually have another question. So if... Yep. Oh, no, there's someone screaming for the microphone. Jim, please identify yourself.
Thanks, Gwen. Jim Pollard, I'm a former board member, a journalist from The Nation. Languishing in semi-retirement. Thank you, Ashley, for your rundown. I'm just wondering if you can explain why you have sort of a negative conclusion of how this civil strife is going to play out. You know, I haven't spoken to Tony Davis lately. I don't know how. I mean, it looks as though you know, what the change that he has documented here or sort of described here in a couple of talks of the way that the resistance is beginning to win or, you know, now has control possibly in over half the country. But why do you think it's just going to go on and they're maybe not going to win, that the army is going to manage to stay presumably in a state of, you know, rotten equilibrium with the resistance?
Thank you. Yes, no, of course, it's a good question. I understand the question. I wouldn't say I have a negative view. I would push back on that. I mean, I find the resilience that I'm talking about.
Ashley, you said that you actually had very bleak prognosis for Myanmar and that it's completely failing and it's going to collapse.
But I don't feel negative about that.
Right, okay.
So,
I think there's a bit of a disconnect there.
Let me explain myself. I feel very positive.
Sorry, but I think
the title of the book is Emergent Federal Systems and Resilience. And I can't believe I've been sitting up here for nearly an hour talking about the extraordinary activities of communities and EAOs and the way that they've retaken their countries and are providing health and education in the context of such an incredible struggle. I mean, I find that inspiring, so that's the positive for me. Prior to the coup, it was a really uphill struggle when meeting with donors and diplomats, which I occasionally do, or anyone for that matter, to argue for the importance of ethnic self-determination in Myanmar. I think even after the Rohingya genocide, most of the international community, at least the Western international community who pay for the kind of projects I sometimes work on, threw their lot behind Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD-led government. And so the idea that actually this wasn't going to work and that we should be better focusing on the demands and aspirations of ethnic nationality communities, I got very little, few people had time for such a narrative. Whereas now, the arguments for ethnic self-determination are easier to make, because now it's the alternative is an illegal, illegitimate, violent, horrible military junta, whereas previously it was a sort of semi-civilian Aung San Suu Kyi-led central government. So in that sense, I think the arguments I'm making are a bit easier, but the question was about negativity and positivity. So I feel positive because following the death of the old Myanmar, a new Burma can be born. So I think that's a really, positive thing. But I think the question was more about the military situation on the ground. So where's the map again? So in terms of who controls what, I think it's a big could I have the PowerPoint back again? You will recall anyway the map, right? This one, yeah, great. Okay, great, good. So this issue of control is quite important, because if we look at the map on the right, I think it's probably true that the Myanmar junta controls less than 50% of the country. That doesn't mean that the diverse opposition forces control the other 50% of the country. I think the armed opposition groups do control extensive parts of Myanmar, but a lot of it is actively contested now. So the question is whether the very significant military and political achievements of the anti-junta opposition in the last 2 years will result in a final military and political victory over the SAC junta, and then the assumption of power on the part of progressive democratic forces, presumably associated with EAOs, PDFs and the NUG. I think we're a long way from that still, to be honest. I think it's important to be realistic, and I think that the areas which are noteworthy and where we should be celebrating the achievements of the opposition forces are perhaps more in terms of achieving a degree of self-determination and local self-control in the context of an ongoing armed struggle. In the book, I quote Bertil Lintner a couple of times near the beginning, and Bertil's been doing this even longer than I have. And I won't read it out, you can find it later. He basically also believes that this struggle is going to drag on and on. I haven't seen anything that makes me believe that either side is going to win in terms of their defined war aims. I guess it depends how we define victory. I think the national unity government definition of victory would be for the Myanmar army to give up any political aspirations and return to the barracks and never be involved in politics in the future. I think that is an excellent aim. I would fully endorse that. I think that's really something worth struggling for. Mm-hmm. I think we're still a long way from achieving that. And I guess if there is I don't think it's a pessimistic view, but I think it's perhaps a sort of brutally realistic view. I think Myanmar's going to fall apart before we find the answer to the question. I think the question of whether Myanmar's going to return to some kind of liberal democratic rule is really not a very relevant question now. I don't think the state of Myanmar is going to recover in my lifetime to look anything like what it did before. So I think the challenge is more how to sort of imagine and think about a new Myanmar. And I think victory in the sense of, well, I guess it depends how we define victory and success, but it's very difficult to see either side militarily overwhelming the other, as far as I can tell.
So would you like to give a little brief idea of how you do see this completely fragmented, failed? You said it's not even fragmented. Well, you said it's completely collapsed. So
that's it, I think, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
my eyesight's pretty bad. Well, I can't see what you mean.
I think in the ethnic nationality areas...
Can you speak into the microphone?
Sorry, in the ethnic nationality areas on this map, apart from Shan State, where there are a number of quite large groups which are not actively fighting the junta. In most of these ethnic areas, the Myanmar central authorities, the junta, really has very little control day to day.
Right.
And so that's what I think victory looks like for a self-determination movement.
Yeah,
right?
so a series of self-contained states.
A series of resilient, self-contained, but hopefully inclusive polities, yes.
Right.
I touched on this earlier, and it's a really important point, inclusivity. Because if you are fighting a war in the name of a particular ethnic group, I mean, the reality in Myanmar, of course, is not like the map here, where we have such clearly demarcated ethnic states. Nearly there.
You're looking for your map.
Thank you. Doesn't look like that, right? There are some parts of the country you can walk across the Karen Hills for days and only meet Score Karen. You could repeat that across many parts of the country. There are certainly parts of Myanmar which are relatively homogenous at sort of the village tract level, maybe even at the township level, but when we get to the level of state, all of Burma's states are mixed. So if you're seeking to establish self-determination in the name of one ethnic group, I think it's very important that we think through what does that mean for people who don't come from that particular community. And that could be people of a different faith, a different gender orientation, or from different ethno-linguistic community. So inclusiveness is important. So when we talk about self-contained states, I think we need to, and I think already we're being dragged away from this conception, the Westphalian conception of self-contained states. I don't think it's going to hold up. It's already beginning to fall apart in the case of Myanmar. So I don't think we can talk about self-contained states, but I think we can talk about ethno-linguistic and faith communities that have cores and peripheries, and the peripheries often overlap with each other, and that's often where tension can emerge, but that's also where creative governance can sometimes come up with some interesting local solutions. So there are some fascinating local experiments by state-based bodies in particular, seeking to engage with the whole range of ethnic communities that might be living in a particular locality. And that kind of inclusiveness is really unprecedented in the history of the country. And again, something I find really inspiring. Yeah.
Right, good, thanks. Yes, and that might be the last question.
All right, okay. So you're advocating...
Could you just identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Joydeep Gupta, the editor-at-large of the Third Pole, which is an environment news website. So you are advocating payment for ecosystem services for the ethnic armed organizations. I don't see how they can be paid directly. It may have to be paid through CSOs, but we hear the junta is getting after CSOs and more or less decimating the CSOs within based within Myanmar. So how is this going to actually happen at scale?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think you're probably right that it's going to be more... I have another publication coming out in a month or so you can invite me back. And that is about global finance mechanisms, global climate finance mechanisms. And one of the main things I'm advocating for is establishing a Myanmar Climate Change Fund, Myanmar Climate Action Fund. Of course, the organizations who might be able to apply for such funding would include CSOs. I think, and I shall continue to advocate for this, although I appreciate it's a rather minority view, I think ethnic armed organizations are legitimate, at least some of them. Obviously, we will each have different criteria, perhaps, and we need to think about what those criteria are for recognizing the credibility and legitimacy of armed groups. There's increasingly loud voices, I think, in the global finance debate. Hugo Slim's recent articles, I think, would be one good example, calling for more decentralization of climate finance, but also to provide climate finance in conflict-affected areas, because that's often where the need is greatest, and Myanmar surely would be pretty near the top of that list. So therefore, I think the question about whether support can go directly to EAOs, there's a performance aspect, which I hope in this book and some of my other work to be able to talk to, and to demonstrate that there are ethnic armed organizations in these areas that have a much better track record than the government of Myanmar ever has. And so in terms of performance legitimacy, that is important. Of course, they're not, these are non-state armed groups, supposedly, and so the reality is that probably money gets channeled through CSOs, and I guess that's normally how the aid world works. I think it's problematic. I do think the money should go to EAOs. There's a lot of funding for education in Myanmar these days. It mostly goes through CSOs, even though most of the schools in ethnic areas are run by EAOs. There are at least 500,000, some calculations say 1 million children attending schools in Myanmar today, or tomorrow. These are schools run by ethnic armed organizations. So at least 500,000, maybe 1 million kids. So that really speaks to the credibility of EAOs as service providers. And in that sense, EAOs are government-like bodies. So I think there's a really strong political argument they should be recognized, but probably it's going to go through CSOs because donors are so risk-averse. We know that. And then your other point, CSOs are certainly being attacked by the junta, but the junta only controls half the country. And so the other half of the country, CSOs, are also subject to airstrikes, etc., of course, as I was just mentioning. But they're some of the most dynamic and internationally well-known CSOs operate out of EAO-controlled territory. I guess Kisan would be the best-known example. I mean, the Salween Peace Park, the winner of the Goldman, what they call it, the Green Nobel Prize, the Goldman Environmental Prize. So internationally recognized climate change action, which has got nothing to do with the SAC, but is operating under the political, the security umbrella and the political leadership of the Karen National Union. So I think it's a good question, of course, and I think that is one of the challenges, and I hope to make a small contribution with this book to demonstrate that EAOs, unlike maybe the typical image we have of armed groups being, money-oriented thugs running around in the jungle, actually these are resistance organizations with their own de facto states, which are worthy of support.
Okay, thanks. I had said last question, but all right, we'll take one more since you've been standing there.
I'm
Can you
Kim
keep it short?
Atkinson. I'm a retired editor and writer in town here. Thank you very much, Dr. South, for your very penetrating view here, and I think it's fascinating. But there's one omission. I wonder if you would kindly be able to tell us what you think would be the interaction of China and other interested foreign countries in this vacuum of power in the future.
Yeah, God, it's a good question. It's a big question.
Try not to go on too long.
Yeah, I'll try not to go on too long. I think China's ahead of the game, I think. I think China has probably the most... Right, so I want to say that a couple of things. I should preface my comments by saying I can think of few things more appalling than living under the authority of the Communist Party of China. Having said that, I think China's Myanmar policy is quite sophisticated and I think really quite successful. So China, I think, doesn't probably intrinsically have much interest one way or the other what happens in Myanmar, so long as Chinese interests are preserved and so long as Myanmar is not part of the Western sphere of influence. And China did become part of the Western sphere of influence under U Thein Sein's regime, but under Aung San Suu Kyi, I think Myanmar shifted back towards the Chinese sphere of influence, and certainly since the coup, it's very much under the Chinese thumb. So China, geopolitically, of course, is a winner from recent developments. I think it's also true that the Chinese state has provided much more support to ethnic armed organizations than any Western countries have. I mean, roads, bridges, industrial infrastructure, weapons, you name it. And the conditionality basically is that EAOs don't challenge China, and sometimes they have to turn up and meet with the dictators and shake hands on camera because that's what the Chinese tell them to. So I guess China's influence is very significant. Some of the northern EAOs who are, to a greater or lesser extent, clients of the Chinese state and military establishment, I think some of those groups really resent it and would like to have alternative international patronage. but the West has been very, very, very slow in providing that kind of support. China has been very quick. You know, if you look along the China border, nearly all of the civilians in EAO-controlled areas have been vaccinated against coronavirus. So, I mean, it's using pretty useless Chinese vaccines, but that, in this context, is not necessarily the point. China and the EAOs have vaccinated all of these civilians, whereas along the Thailand border, despite all the hand-wringing of the West and the millions of dollars committed in aid money, we still have only vaccinated a few tens of thousands of civilians along the southeast border. So I think China actions are significantly ahead of the rest of the world, and I think China's policy is quite coherent, but unfortunately does involve supporting an evil military junta, which of course makes it quite unconscionable in my personal view, but smart.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I'd just like to thank Ashley and thank all of you for coming tonight. And you've heard all about the details of the book. I'm sure Ashley would be happy to talk to anyone who wants to ask him more about vampires or climate change. And please don't forget our program on Monday night. I think that's really going to be quite an exceptional one if you're interested in Thai recent history and the politics of protest, and that Thammasat University, not just Thammasat actually, it was around the centre of Bangkok, that film on Monday night. So thank you everybody, and thank you Ashley.